Okay. So, where did you live as a child?
The first 2 years of my life, I lived in Cleveland, Tennessee, but I remember nothing about that because we moved from there when I was 2 years old. Then we moved to Nashville, Tennessee. I grew up there. We lived in three different houses in Nashville from the time that I was about two till the time that I left home at about age 22. So I'm a Nashvilleian, really, by way of the kind of place and culture that I grew up in to adulthood.
Mm-hmm. And describe your neighborhood when you were in junior high school.
Well, my neighborhood was a suburban neighborhood. It was a middle class neighborhood. Most of the houses were 3 or 4 bedrooms, 2 baths. Some of them were ranch style houses, one level. Some of them were 2 story houses. A very ordinary neighborhood. We lived straight across the street from a large elementary school, Stokes Elementary School in Nashville. That was the school that I started first grade in. But we were not living across the street when I was in the first grade. We lived several miles away, and I had to ride the bus to that school.
Mm-hmm.
So the timing was bad. If we'd lived there when I was in school, I could have walked right across the street
Yeah.
to school and right back home. But that was not to be. The question again, the school?
It was describe your neighborhood when you were in junior high school.
Okay, well,
Not, grades 6 through 9.
actually, I walked about 3 blocks to the school that I was attending when I lived in that neighborhood. It was just up the street, so we didn't have to ride the bus anymore, and that was handy. And we could walk back to school and use the outdoor recreational facilities there during non-school hours, and that was very nice.
Mm-hmm.
So we enjoyed our time at that house and in that neighborhood. And my best friend lived just down the street, so we visited often. And several other friends lived very close. In fact, in the junior high period of my life, and actually we were not a 6 through 9 junior high. We were a 1 through 8, and then high school. But I call junior high the 7th, 8th, and 9th grades. I'm trying to conform to your model there.
Yeah, that's good.
But during that time when I was 12, 13, 14 years old, we lived in that neighborhood, and it was a very pleasant place to grow up in. And there was a drugstore within easy walking distance, and we used to sit around and drink nickel Coca-Colas and dime Coca-Colas. That was the really big one, and you could get a 2-scoop ice cream cone for 15 cents, as I recall. Money went a lot further in those days.
Mm-hmm. That's actually about into what question I'm about to ask you. What music, clothing, and food were popular during your teenage years?
Well,
How much did they cost?
In my teenage years, there was sort of the birth of rock and roll. Little Richard came along then, and Elvis, and the great Fats Domino. And then there was a little fad for a while for calypso music from the Caribbean. Harry Belafonte was the most prominent figure in that particular form. And folk music was beginning to be popular. The Kingston Trio was extremely popular. They sang songs that none of the kids today would listen to for 5 seconds, but they were often the best-selling songs in the country. And we had quite a few of those folks. Bob Dylan began his career a little later, as did Joan Baez, but we had some early folk groups, the Brothers Four, the Kingston Trio, several others that sold an awful lot of records in folk music. I remember when Little Richard first came on the scene, and he was considered sort of a questionable character. But we kind of liked Little Richard because his stuff had a real beat to it, and he was a real character. And the man is still around, pushing 80 years old and performing. So he has lasted where many others have fallen along the wayside.
Uh-huh. And
Tutti Frutti or Rudy.
yeah, what type of clothing and food were popular also?
Well, food wasn't a whole lot of different. We had a lot of burgers, and we ate a lot of hot dogs, and we ate a lot of fries. We ate a lot of the same kind of junk food that kids eat today.
Mm-hmm.
there was a little place, a little concrete block building about a mile from our school. That little place was called Joe's. And it was a place where you sat in your car and the car hop came out to take your order, and he went back to the building and he brought your burger and your fries and your drink back to you. And after every basketball game, a whole bunch of us headed over to Joe's, and we sat there parked in our cars in that gravel parking lot. And a car hop, a black car hop named Willie, who really had a personality, would bring us our food, and we'd sit there and talk about the ball game, talk about girls if you were boys, talk about boys if you were girls, and have a good time for maybe 45 minutes to an hour hanging around Joe's Joint on Hillsborough Road or close to it. The place is now long gone, and so folks go now to Burger King and McDonald's, not to these unique, one-of-a-kind places like Joe's anymore, because they've pretty much disappeared from the landscape.
Oh, that's a shame. What type of clothing did you wear that was popular?
Well, there were some clothing fads. There was a time, which I particularly remember, when black and pink were the colors of choice for boys or girls. Many, many shirts and pants and caps and socks and belts and ties were in black and pink. I never understood how that got started, but I wore some black and pink myself. And when you went to school, you would expect to see an awful lot of black and pink. And then it seems just as fast as that fad came along, it died out, and I don't think we've been into black and pink in this country since, although I've seen now in the last couple of years pink shirts being worn by men without any reservation about their masculinity. So maybe we've seen a little bit of that coming back. But also I remember the very thin belt, usually a sort of a metallic finish, a very thin belt that boys would wear on their pants. And we also had the little buckles in the middle of the back up at the top of the pants. That was kind of an Ivy League feature. And there was a fad for a while with the Ivy League cap, with the button down front and the little buckle in the back. And every single boy in Nashville, Tennessee, between the ages of 11 and 17 must have had an Ivy League cap, because you never went anywhere without seeing everybody in the Ivy League cap. Somebody made a lot of money selling Ivy League caps.
Yeah, they must have. What was the ethnic breakdown in your school?
The ethnic breakdown of my school was, in a word or two, white people, because this was in the era of racial segregation. So we were all white, predominantly Anglo-Saxon, Scots-Irish, Southern white folks. We did have a few Jewish children in our classes, and we all got along quite well, us white people and Jews, and we just were populated in our school in the way that social and legal customs provided for in that time.
Uh-huh.
We were mighty white.
Because there was segregation?
What's that?
Segregation?
What about it?
There was segregation.
Well, it was segregation, yes.
Yeah.
In the public schools, they were definitely racially segregated. There were black public schools and white public schools.
Okay.
Water fountains were segregated.
Yeah, everything was.
And in a little town I worked in when I was older in South Carolina, I remember seeing even a segregated jukebox. It had a little note on it, whites only. Black folks couldn't put their nickel in and hear the song they wanted to. They just wanted them to come in and stand up and get their ice cream and leave, and not hang around playing the jukebox. Now that was in South Carolina, not in Nashville.
Oh, that makes sense then. How did one do for amusement? How did they do for amusement?
Well, we did a lot of things for amusement. We played board games. We watched television some, not as much as a lot of folks do now. I played a lot of tennis for amusement, because that was my game. That was my passion at the time. We had parties. I recall never going to any party in my teen years when any alcohol of any kind was served or even thought about being served. They were tamer times. We played pickup softball and baseball games when we could get enough of us organized to do that. And we probably played more touch football informally than any other outdoor sport. And the people that I ran around with, we played an awful lot of table tennis. Our school had a table tennis table in an old building, and at lunch and breaks and whenever we could, and sometimes after school, there were maybe a dozen of us that would hang around playing table tennis. We wasted a lot of time batting that little plastic ball around, and we got pretty good at it.
What illnesses were threatening the health of the community in this country?
Well,
at
that time, now when I was about 14 years old, polio was still a big public health problem. And I have this very distinctive memory of being warned in so many ways by parents and other concerned people about not getting tired, because it was thought that if you really got fatigued, if you really got very, very tired, you were more susceptible to catching polio. So we were told, get plenty of sleep, don't play until you're exhausted, just don't get all that tired because it makes you more likely to get polio. And we believed that stuff. And my grandmother, who lived with us one day, came home with a bottle of the nastiest tasting stuff I've ever put in my mouth. And it was some kind of concoction cooked up by some local pharmacist that she knew that was supposed to strengthen your blood and your immune system and help children to guard against or to fight against catching polio. And we had to drink a tablespoon of that stuff every night until we ran out of it. And it was just terrible, dreadful stuff. And of course, it had no effect at all upon polio or protecting from polio, but we drank that miserable stuff, and it was awful. But one day, in our English class, in my sophomore year in high school, we walked in and we noticed a notation on the top of the blackboard, and it said SALK, S-A-L-K, 98% effective. And our teacher explained to us that there had been a news release just a few minutes before. The result of testing the first polio vaccine, the Salk vaccine, were in, and it was hugely successful. And that meant something extremely important. No longer, once children were vaccinated, was that terrible fear of polio and the possible paralysis and handicapped conditions that could result from that. And immediately after that, the vaccine was distributed all over the country. And kids by the millions took it. It was a shot, the most painful shot I ever had in my arm. And the condition under which I got that was something that would never happen today. The father of my tennis doubles partner picked me and my doubles partner up at the tennis court. He said, I'm going to take you boys somewhere. And he took us to the Melrose bowling alley, and they had people lined up, kids, to get their polio shot. And we got in line, and I got my polio shot. I got a vaccination without consent of my parents, without any direction from the doctor, just walked in and got it. It was that important. It was that well received. These days, if a parent took somebody else's kid without the parents' permission to get a vaccination, they would be sued for multiplied millions of dollars, I suppose, in this litigious society. But it didn't work that way with the Salk vaccine. And polio was a thing of the past shortly after that.
Well, that's good. Moving on to jobs and professions. What jobs did you have throughout your life?
Well, other than jobs when I was in high school or college, your short-term jobs, I've been a professional biologist and environmental consultant for the last approximately 43 or 4 years. I've worked with endangered species. I've worked with various kinds of environmental permitting. I've done a lot of work examining real estate for evidence of environmental contamination. I worked on the famous snail darter case when I was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the most highly publicized endangered species case ever. In the last 16 years, I've worked as a private industry consultant. I've done work planning examining the corridors that are planned for construction of pipelines, looking for things like endangered species, wetlands, waterways, environmentally valuable amenities that need to be avoided or mitigated during pipeline construction. I have helped defend one business that holds one group of investors that hold a conservation easement within a golf course that entitles them to a very large federal income tax break. We won the first case ever brought in that realm of the law, hands down, in the court in Birmingham, and that's probably one of the highlights of my career. But it's all been biology and environmental and natural resources, and very enjoyable.
Oh, okay. What did your job or jobs entail? Did you enjoy your work?
I think I described some of that. I've enjoyed it very much. It's been hands-on practical biology. The first part of my career was spent with the Division of Fish Hatcheries of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we raised fish. We raised fish for stocking of farm ponds and public, state, and federal water bodies. We raised warm water fish, largemouth bass, bluegill, shellcrackers or red air sunfish, and channel catfish. And these hands have literally handled millions of little tiny baby fish. But I left that pursuit in 1972 and went to a more politically involved and activist branch of the Fish and Wildlife Service, the part that reviews and comments on and tries to affect dams and reservoirs and Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation projects. We were kind of the troublemaking branch of the Fish and Wildlife Service. I was with them for several years. I left them after serving as chief of the branch of federal permits and licenses in Washington, D.C., and went over to EPA to be the branch chief of the program that runs the Section 404 program, which is basically a wetlands and waterways protection program that was capable of infuriating any congressman in any district at any given time. And that too was a lot of fun, because infuriating certain congressmen can be a very rewarding thing.
Yeah. Did you attend college? And if so, what did you study?
I attended and graduated from David Lipscomb College, now Lipscomb University, with a Bachelor of Arts degree in biology. I took a little graduate work in natural resources at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I've had some graduate work in fish diseases at Mississippi State University.
Okay. Moving on to general questions. What presidents or national leaders do you recall?
I distinctly recall President Harry Truman, the first president that I remember. I remember my parents talking about President Roosevelt, but I never was aware at the time that he was president, that he was the president. Mm-hmm. I was very much aware of President Truman, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, all the presidents from there forward. But I suppose Truman and Eisenhower were the presidents during my childhood. And I distinctly remember Truman winning an election against Governor Tom Dewey of New York when everyone expected Mr. Truman to lose. I remember hearing the reports and hearing adults talking about how surprised they were that Mr. Truman won. I worked for the campaign. As a 12-year-old, I worked for the Eisenhower campaign a couple of Saturdays, helping adults to hand out "I Like Ike" bumper stickers in parking lots around Nashville, Tennessee. I think Eisenhower was an interesting character. He was a Republican, and I no longer have a whole lot of use for Republicans, but I was a good little worker for Ike back there in the 1950s. If I had been an adult and if I had been more intelligent and informed, I would have been working for Adlai Stevenson.
And any particular national leaders you recall?
National leaders? Well, besides presidents, is this from my childhood you're talking about?
Most particularly, yeah, mostly.
Um,
Or in your 20s.
yeah, I admired Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior during the Kennedy administration. Secretary Udall was an extremely knowledgeable person about natural resources, and he was very strongly committed to protecting and conserving those resources. He later became a writer, a very competent writer on several topics, including nuclear issues, including the detonation of nuclear bombs in the American West and some of the ill effects that that has caused upon a lot of people that have not been widely recognized. He died only a short time ago in his 90s, but when I worked in Washington on a 6-month assignment in 1968 69, he was the secretary, and I observed operations up there, and I talked to others that knew him personally, and I followed his career later, and I very much admired the person. Another public figure, national leader, I have to call him, that I admired was Edward R. Murrow, the great journalist, great wartime journalist in Europe, and later on a premier journalist on the CBS television network who told things the way they were and who was brave and bold enough to confront the terrible, egregious, drunken, nutcake Senator Joseph McCarthy, as McCarthy created hysteria in this country with his reports of infiltration of communists into the government. Murrow was one of those who was bold enough to speak out against the outrages perpetrated by Senator McCarthy. And even as a teenager and younger, I could see that this man was a man of integrity, that he was a leading thinker on issues of that kind, that he could see the misshapen form that history would take if Senator McCarthy was allowed to prevail. One of the figures in American history of my time that I admire most, Edward R. Murrow.
Oh, okay. What were some of the important news or current events that you remember, and how did you receive the news?
Well, I definitely remember the shooting of President Kennedy in 1963. I was at work at the Marion National Fish Hatchery in Alabama and the Warm Water Training School there. And the secretary looked at me as I walked in the door and she said, "They've shot the president." And I said, "Who and what?" And she explained it. And just a very few minutes later, the report came from Walter Cronkite that the president was dead. I remember standing there in that particular place and looking in the eyes of Elizabeth Mitchell and seeing how alarmed she was over that event. I remember 9/11. I was standing in a cow pasture near Fort Pierce, Florida, and we were doing a natural resource survey of a pipeline route, looking at a small stream that ran through that pasture, and my cell phone rang, and it was an engineer back at the project office, and they called us in. They said, "Quit work, something's happened," and he described what had happened. And I turned around and told my two assistants about that, and we got in the SUV and went back. We went back the next morning to that same place, which was next to a Florida Power Company electrical substation. And we had just walked in and around the fence the day before, but a deputy sheriff, a pudgy young man of about 32 or 3 years old, walked toward our car with his hand on his pistol and a glare in his eye, and he said, "You got business here?" And we said, "Well, yes, we stopped here working yesterday. We were doing a survey around the end of the fence there and over into the pasture." And he said, "Well, I'm here because of what happened yesterday. You know what happened yesterday?" And we said, "Yes, sir, we know." And he said, "I have orders to shoot to kill anybody that wants to go over that fence." And it was an 8-foot high chain link fence with 3 or 4 strands of barbed wire. So we assured him we had no intent of climbing over into that fence and wandering around in high powered, high voltage electrical equipment that easily could kill us. And he said, "All right, but I'll be watching you." And so we walked around the fence and we did our business and we left. and Barney Fife did not have to raise his gun to us to stop us from jumping over the fence and interrupting a circuit with our bodies and turning off the lights in 2/3 of South Florida.
That was on the 9/11 event?
9/11, that was 9/11.
Oh, okay. Do you remember much about Martin Luther King Jr.?
I remember a great deal about Martin Luther King Jr. I remember where I was when he was shot. I had acted in a little community play in Alabama, and we were having the cast party after the play, and someone had a radio on in another room, and they came in and they told us about the shooting of Martin Luther King, and we were all astonished. Remember, I was living in segregationist Alabama in the 60s, and there were some hardcore segregationists there, and I have to say I was saddened at some of the expressions that I heard following that by some of the racist people that lived in that little black belt community, Marion, Alabama, and Perry County. We had some people whose hearts were definitely not in the right place at that time. And you had to be careful what you said because they just as soon pop you one as look at you.
Yeah. Describe your kitchen and schoolrooms. What technological items were in these places?
In where now?
Your kitchen and schoolrooms?
Well, in the schoolroom now, we weren't very high tech when I was in school. There was a little thing that nobody has anymore except maybe in a museum. It's called a spirit duplicator, and a teacher could write some things on a piece of paper and put it in this hand-cranked device, and it had a big wax drum on it, and they used some kind of alcohol-based ink, and it was always a sort of a bluish purple, and they cranked that thing round and round, and they duplicated whatever it was in the original, and it smelled up the place pretty bad. And when you got that in front of you at your desk, the lingering vapors of whatever that solvent was would come off that, and you would smell that. It wasn't even as sophisticated as a mimeograph machine. Nobody had a copy machine. I remember the first copy machine I ever used. It had a package of 2 pieces of paper, and they were kind of wet, and you put them in the machine, or they were dry. I guess you put them in the machine, they came out wet. Then you separated it, and you put the one sheet out to dry, and when it dried, it was a kind of a very light brown, and it had an image of whatever was printed on that. Very, very primitive, no more. Not anything like the flippity, 30 sheets a minute coming out of our copy machines today. Very primitive. We didn't have any GPSs. I worked on a survey crew. They used the standard instrument that's been used probably for the last 100 years before then. Nobody had any laser guided equipment. We were just late Bronze Age, I guess, but we got things done.
And what about your kitchens? Did you have all the technology that we have today, or you had different things?
Well, the first refrigerator I remember in any kitchen when I was a kid, it had a single door, and the freezer compartment was about maybe 1 cubic foot. And mostly you put just ice trays in there or a few frozen things, but there was just very little capacity there. We called it the ice box, like some people still do, but it was an electric refrigerator. And it was pretty primitive by today's standards, and pretty small too, maybe 2/3 the size of an average refrigerator now. And in that time, nobody ever put stuff on the refrigerator with tapes or magnets. I remember that. It was always just the plain white enamel finish, not embellished with any childish artwork or advertising material or anything like that.
What were some, in particular, inventions that had just been invented around your young age, I guess?
Well, one invention I remember was the ballpoint pen. Believe it or not, they have not always been around. And my father came in one day and he said, "I've got a new kind of pen." And he had 2 or 3 of them. They were made of aluminum, and they had a little sliding device on the end that covered up the point, and then you pulled it back and you exposed the point and you could write. And the ink came out sort of irregularly, and sometimes it skipped spaces, and sometimes you got a little clump of ink, but you could actually write with this thing without loading it with ink like a fountain pen. And those were the first ballpoint pens I had ever seen, and they certainly are primitive by the standards that we have today. But everyone thought that was just sort of an amazing device, the ballpoint pen.
Any more exciting inventions? Any more exciting inventions?
Something more exciting than a ballpoint pen.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, of course, television had just begun to be available in our part of the country at that time. 1949, my father bought a Raytheon television set with a 16-inch perfectly round screen. And that wasn't a full 16 inches, of course. It's nominally 16 inches. It's about that big. And we watched that thing, and we watched only one channel, WSM Television in Nashville, because that was the only channel they had. Later they got WLAC, the CBS affiliate. They got WSIX, the ABC affiliate. WSM was the NBC affiliate. So we had 3 whole network television channels. And that's all we had for a number of years. But that's all you could get. There was no cable. And I do remember an invention. It was called the kinescope. The kinescope was a very crude form of recording television programs. You didn't have that in your house. It was done by the network or by the local station, and it was much reduced in quality from the original television transmission. You could look at the screen, you could see, well, that's a kinescope, because the quality of it was pretty sorry, but you could tell what's going on. I remember when the instant replay was first invented, when they could go and take that television recording and run back a touchdown or a home run or a good shot in tennis, the instant replay. And you had to wait 3 or 4 minutes before they got it all backed up and ready to go. But then they would say, and now we have the instant replay, and you could see it again. Of course, now you can sit with your control at your own TV set, and that little magical control box that does everything, and you can run your own instant replays of anything you want to. But we thought that was a big deal, the invention of the instant replay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, describe the cars that you owned.
Well, let me describe first the car that I liked the best for a long time. When I was a teenager, it was one of the family cars. It was a 1952 Studebaker Commander. It was what is called a hardtop convertible, 2 doors, and they were great big long doors. And then the windows went all the way down without any post between them, and you had a lot of light and air there. It wasn't air conditioned because hardly any cars were at that time. That would have been a very new thing. And it had a manual shift. It was gray on the bottom and maroon on the top. And I just thought it was great because it was the first car I got to drive off in by myself. And I dated and ran around in that car, and we did some mischievous things in that car around town and had a good old time. But that car stayed around the family for about 10 years, and the gear shift got so loose that if you listened carefully to the engine speed, you could shift through almost all the gears without using the clutch. Now, the first car I had was one given to me by my parents, a Chevy 2, 1962, and I drove away with my bride from our honeymoon, for our honeymoon in that car, and that car lasted, 7 or 8 years, and we put over 100,000 miles on it. Had to have the oil changed about every 2,000 miles. I put seat belts in it because it didn't come without seat belts. Went down to the Western Auto, bought them, drilled the holes in the frame, put the seat belts in. It was a good little car.
That's good. Safety. And
we had at one time a 1974 Thunderbird. That was a horse of a car. Really enjoyed that thing. Leather seats, smooth riding. Bought it after the first Arab oil embargo pushed gas prices up to a horrible 78 cents a gallon, and people were unloading their big gas guzzlers. And I bought it at a bargain price, and we drove it for several years, and that was a nice, comfortable car.
Very good. What were some other modes of transportation you have taken?
Well, I've flown in airplanes, and I've ridden in trains, and I've taken the trip up the ski lift at the Alaska Ski Resort in Alaska. I've traveled in small boats, never in an ocean liner or anything like that. I've flown in government planes in a lot of interesting places, spent about 3 hours in the air over northern Maine and southern Canada at a time when the leaf color change was at its most intense. Flew over thousands of acres of forest land that was golden and orange and red, and one of the most scenic things that I have ever seen. And I've traveled in airboats in the Everglades when I worked down there, and those are interesting sort of mode of transportation, because you have to learn to handle them in ways that you don't handle any other kinds of vehicles. You have to push the control lever the way you think it shouldn't go, and you just have to train yourself to do it. But that's about it for transportation. I had a motorcycle one time, but gave it up when I got to be a father in the city of Atlanta. I didn't want to risk my life and limb on a motorcycle. I felt okay with it out in the country where I used it mostly, but sold it off when it got dangerous.
Oh, that's good. Describe and briefly talk about someone you admire or admired.
One person that I have always admired was my high school science teacher, Dr. John T. Netterville. He was not a doctor when he was my high school teacher. He later also became my college chemistry teacher. This was a man who had the greatest teaching skills, the greatest ability to impart information from his mind to those of his students of any teacher that I have ever known. He's still living in his 80s, and may he have a long and happy continued life, because he contributed hugely to my ability to think through problems and to understand issues in science, especially in chemistry. He was a genius of a teacher, and I admired him greatly.
That's good. You must have learned a lot from him, I guess.
I did. One other person I admired a great deal, a former Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Nathaniel Reed. He was my boss's boss when I was with the Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington. He was a Floridian dedicated to protecting and conserving the natural resources of his home state, which were in a lot of jeopardy. And I did a lot of work for him. I wrote some speeches for him. I briefed him on difficult matters that were before his agency that I was working on, and he impressed me as a very sincere and dedicated public official who let politics get in his way as little as possible, considering the relatively high office that he occupied. And that man did a great deal to keep Florida from being in any more of a mess than it is, natural resources wise.
What time period were you the most having problems or most unsuccessful? You know, what time period would that be, you think, for you throughout your life?
Well, when was I? I mean, like maybe more frustrated in being able to get done what I wanted to do.
Yeah, go elaborate on that.
Yeah, I suppose in a way, I had some frustrations when I worked in the Atlanta office of the Fish and Wildlife Service. I was in a position where I had to handle reports that were generated in 12 states in that region. And we had some young, very activist biologists out in our field stations who wanted to protect every square inch, literally, of marsh and wetland and never let anybody do anything that could disturb it in the least. That was not practical. And when I modified their recommendations away from that totalitarian conservationist or preservationist perspective, sometimes they got angry with me. I felt I was doing the right thing because I was sensitive to the political implications of being too demanding we, in fact, later on almost lost a very important conservation program initiative because of excessive demands by one of our Texas offices along those same lines. So it was a case of trying to do, and I believe doing the right thing, and yet making some colleagues pretty unhappy. And that was an uncomfortable situation, but it was one I learned to live with.
That's sounds kind of sad.
Speak up a little. If you...
Oh, sorry. What is the funnest, or not fun, but most fun or exciting trip you've ever taken? Journey or voyage?
I think the most exciting trip I ever took was a 3-week trip to the Cascade Mountain area, and particularly around Mount St. Helens in Washington State, on a Bigfoot hunt. Now, there was a fellow I knew in Florida who was very good at persuading people to finance his adventures. And he got enough financing to put several people in the field looking for Bigfoot in Skamania County, Washington, one of the hotbeds of Bigfoot reports. And we didn't find Bigfoot, but we had a great time hiking and camping and enjoying the wildlife and the scenery around Mount St. Helens about 5 or 6 years before it blew its top in 1980. At one time, a couple of us were taking an afternoon nap near the base of the mountain, and we just talked about how if that volcano exploded today, we would both be dead meat in a hurry. We would be evaporated or vaporized. And we dozed off to sleep, and there was a big explosion, and we both sat bolt upright and looked at each other, and we were thinking, this is it, we're dead. And then we found out it was a crew blasting rock from a cliff or a rock face across a road down the hill from us to make rock to pave a roadway. We saw all the rock dust coming up. We heard them yelling, and we were relieved to find that we need not expect to be vaporized in the next few minutes. But our hearts were going pitter patter.
Okay. I guess that concludes our interview. So,
Okay.
good job. Thank you.
Thank you.